Okay, committee, thanks for your patience. Thanks for getting over here quickly from the floor. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. The first item on the agenda is the minutes that were sent to you on Tuesday, March the 1st. And I've been told that these dates have been verified and correct. So I need a motion to approve the minutes for January 20th, February 1st, 3rd, 8th, 10th, 15th, and 17th. Motion by Representative Dodson, seconded by Representative Highland. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All against, say no. Motion passes. Minutes are approved. The second item on the agenda is an update from the Kansas Department of Labor. Secretary Amber Schultz, welcome back to committee. And wow, what a difference a year makes, right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Yeah, yes, indeed. So thank you for inviting us here today. Again, I'm Amber Schultz, Secretary of the Kansas Department of Labor. I have with me Deputy Secretary Peter Brady, in case anybody really wants to get into the weeds. And then I have some of our staff, Julie Mangini and Jessica Dragoo, if anybody would like to advocate for a pay raise on their behalf. Let's see. So today I'm just going to give you some brief updates on House Bill 2001, which was, you recall, is the special session. What our where we are in modernization, an update on our trust fund, kind of just some other updates of where we are now as an agency. So with that, House Bill 2001, as you recall, was part of the special session at the end of the year, right around Thanksgiving. And what that did was it created a couple provisions for people to be able to have a religious or medical exemption to the COVID-19 vaccine. If the employer failed to offer or refused those exemptions, they could be eligible for unemployment benefits, and they also could file a complaint with the agency. So as of the end of February, we have received 204 total complaints. We do offer, obviously, hearings as part of due process. So 4 hearings have been requested and held. 12 complaints were voluntarily withdrawn for one reason or another. That could have been that, as the legislation intended, that their employer offered them their employment back with back pay, or I think I mentioned this at another committee meeting. Excuse me, they were self-employed. That's fun. So if they're self-employed, they obviously can't file a complaint against their employer. Of those 204, we have issued 132 final orders, finding no violations. Today we have 60 complaints that are still pending. These are all timely, by the way, within the 60-day window, and we referred 0 cases to the Attorney General's office. We do have 20 that are pending adjudication, so before they can be eligible, obviously, for unemployment insurance, we would have to conduct that hearing, so we do have 20 people waiting for the determination on that hearing. So with that, Chairman, if it pleases you, I'll see if there's any questions, but then continue.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good time to go ahead and take questions on HB 2001. Any questions for Secretary? Representative Kessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I was writing slow or you were talking fast. How many were referred to the AG?
0.
Okay.
Representative Hoffman. Representative Highland.
We've had 204. Mm-hmm.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So 100 and some you said were not eligible, or the complaints were dismissed?
A final determination had been issued.
So what was the determination of why they were dismissed?
I don't have those exact numbers in front of me, but we can certainly get you some of those. Some of them were voluntarily, some of them they just didn't meet the provisions of the law, that they had not been terminated or demoted or in any way detrimentally affected because of any mandates.
Okay, but it'd be kind of interesting to see maybe if you could get us just a rundown of some of those.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be good to get that. So you're saying the 132 that were no violations, they're all still employed and were not punished in any way.
Yep.
That's what the determination was.
Yep. Or they, voluntarily quit employment. They were not terminated.
Okay. And 204 seems like a lower number than we were reported about a month ago when we had our joint meeting with the Senate. I'll have to go back and maybe watch that, but it seemed like there was about 300 at that time.
Sharon, if I remember correctly, I think I want to say we were in the 160s or 180s back then, and they've been trickling in since then. There's been a considerable downtick.
Okay, and of the 20 or the 60 that are pending,
Mhm.
what what are you waiting for, or what are you waiting on, or how can we help those people get to a determination?
Right, the provisions of the bill again are 60 days. So we do provide a due process both for the employer and the employee. So when we receive that complaint, we notify the employer and we ask if either party would like to schedule a hearing. And so it's very much an appellate type due process. And so just depending on, the nature of the responsiveness of both the employer or the employee, there could be a variety of time. It could be very quickly, it could be drawn out, but we do have limits for response times and hearings, so we can make sure that we hit that 60 days.
Okay, and so if I were to file a complaint today, my employer would get a notification within how long?
I think that is 3 days.
And then how long would my employer have to get back to you?
I think that entire notification, like the initial kickoff, is 5 days, but I can verify that for you.
So you have this information back within 5 days typically? And why do you need 60 days after that? Or
we have 60 days as part of HB 2001, but not all of these are taking 60 days.
Okay. What can you tell us what the oldest one is?
I want to say the oldest one we have is from 111.
Okay, and so that's coming up pretty
Pretty
close. And you have yet to find one that's stuck. And so the bill might have worked. I've had a couple that I sent up that haven't been gotten, or I guess I sent an email and people haven't gotten back to them yet, but they did lose their job. And so I'm interested to hear back on that one. And then I have another one that's coming, I think, in today, but I have a hard time understanding that there's only 204 with all the calls that I've received on this. Is it difficult to find on the website?
No, we do have it on our front page that if you would like to file a complaint.
Okay. Any other questions on HB 2001? Yep. Yeah. Seeing no questions, you can proceed with the unemployment.
All right. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick update on our modernization efforts. As you recall, I think in my last update, we're still in negotiations with a vendor. So as soon as we have another update, I will certainly bring you that as soon as I can. Our trust fund right now is at $687 million. And where that sits is where we were right between 2018 and 2019. As you know, with first quarter contributions coming up, I believe in April, the April timeframe, we'll come back with another balance update. And then additionally, we are working with the Unemployment Modernization Council on an audit. And so there potentially could be another $250 million added to the trust fund. All right, so just general where we are now, as a reminder, since March of 2020, which it's hard to believe that was 2 years ago, we've paid out over 5.2 million weekly claims, totaling over $3.4 billion. In December, which was our last unemployment rate release, we were at 3.3%, which pre-pandemic we were at 3.2% as a state. Great news on call volumes since the beginning of February, so just a couple weeks ago. They've been our call volumes have dropped by half. I remember the first day that our Mondays are always our busiest day. Since I've been here for a year, well over 10,000. Like when we got to the 10,000 mark, I was pretty excited. And so they're down around 4,000 or 5,000 on Mondays, and then on a typical day, about 2,000 to 2,300. So that's very exciting. And one of the things that is contributing to that is, if you remember, the mainframe, our friend, sometimes has to have what is done, it's called claims maintenance. Very complicated claims that bounce back from one program to another over the pandemic, and we actually have to have people go in and program these claims to get paid out. And so in February, we paid about $20 million worth of claims through claims maintenance, and we are now fixing those claims maintenance within a week of receiving notification about them. As you probably heard, we are seeing an uptick in initial claims. Of course, nothing compared to during the pandemic. And so we are finding that there are fraudsters still trying to attack us now that they understand that we have this pretty large pot of money. They are coming back. But if you'll notice, the claims paid out is remaining steady. So the good news is we are catching a majority of those fraudsters before any claims get paid out. We do still have a backlog in fraud. So typically, I know we've talked about fraud a lot for this committee, but this isn't identity verification fraud. This is, wage fraud, initial claim fraud, fraudulent documentation that they've submitted to the agency. And so all of our backlog really is in that space or appeals. So we have two kind of buckets of fraud that we work in the agency. We have 3,500 cases under investigation under SI unit. And then we have, 1,200 claims. And we have a possible non-reporting of earnings, so wage fraud. We have some disqualifications, prior fraudulent disqualifications. And then about 3,000 in our PUA, which, as you recall, is the pandemic unemployment, or sorry, I'm fighting a cold, so I'm a little bit medicined up. The gig workers for initial claims fraud. So the other bucket, appeals. Regular UI, our appeals backlog is about 3,000. We're working claims from mid-October right now. The good news in appeals is that last week, our nominees for KESBOR were approved, so we expanded our kind of higher level appeals so that we can get those worked through much more quickly. And then the last thing I want to bring up is that we've been working very closely with the U.S. Department of Labor on grant opportunities. And so we were one of 5 states, an inaugural group of 5 states that had what they call tiger teams, what they really are kind of SWAT teams of subject matter experts to come in and take a look at our operations. And so they provided 10 recommendations for us. And we're hoping that very soon they'll have grant opportunities so we can implement the ones that actually cost a little bit more than we have and available on our funds. And then we're also applying for an equity grant and also a navigator grant. So we're hoping to have a little bit of additional funding to do some initiatives that we'd like to do. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm done with my update.
We'll open for question. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to go back to the modernization, the vendor selection. I mean, we're approaching now six months. It's been about 5 months since a selection was made. We're approaching almost 6 months now. When do we get to that point where we've decided that maybe we need to stop and start this process again? Because evidently we're running into some problems. I mean, 6 months seems like to me we should have already had this the vendor the vendor was selected, we should already have this done by now.
Right. Thank you for that question, Representative Hoffman. So part of HB 2196, which was passed in the 2021 session, there's a provision in there that did not allow us to sign a contract or have funds executed until the Modernization Committee provided the LCC a letter, and then we received notice that the LCC received and approved your letter. We received that in early January of 2022. So this is a very complicated modernization process, going from 40-old plus decades technology to, bring us to something that will take us to many years ahead. Unfortunately, can't say a whole lot because there is a pretty tall wall between the PNC and anybody else in the agency, but
Well, I understand that. I mean, I'm on the PNC, so
Yes.
I understand, but I still, negotiations have been going on before January. And so I think we need to get this done, or we need to reevaluate what's happening.
Right, and so I appreciate that. And so we'll work with the Department of Administration, who actually, manages the procurement, to see what they would recommend.
Yeah, so I think that I think that the funds were released to you well before January, and it's my understanding that there were 4 companies that bid. You narrowed it down to 2, and your first choice is no longer available for some reason. Just kind of putting things together from meeting people in the hallways and things, but it sounds to me like the initial choice that you guys wanted as number 1 fell through recently, and so you're negotiating with number 2. Can you shed some light on that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. No, I cannot, because we've all signed NDAs, and frankly, I'm surprised that got out of the negotiating room.
On October 25th, the Modernization Council made a recommendation to reopen the RFP, and that was 5 months ago, approximately. Now that we're down to just one company to negotiate, wouldn't you agree that it would be a good idea to reopen the RFP and get some competitive bids from other companies that are out there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a couple of things on that front. One, I would like to see the current negotiation to fruition. If there becomes an impasse, certainly we would be able to consider that, but to simply cancel, this is what I understand from my colleagues over at the Department of Administration, if we were to simply cancel this RFP process right now, anyone that bid would be found to be unqualified or disqualified, so they could not bid on the next process.
Our current vendors wouldn't be allowed to?
That is my understanding, but I
Our
will
vendor.
confer with that if we were to cancel it and reissue the same bid.
Representative Auerkamp?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, 1 or 2 questions. Earlier you mentioned something about 250 million, and I was jotting down some notes. Can you
Sure,
go
thank
back
you.
and
So part of House Bill 2196 from the 2021 legislative session allocated $500 million to be put into the trust fund. So the first $250 million was put into the trust fund in July of 2021. The second half, the second $250 million, was dependent on an audit that is being run by the Unemployment Modernization Council to see how much fraudulent or improper payments we paid out during the pandemic. And so if it's up to $250 million, that would be pushed over to the trust fund. If it's less than that, it will be that number that's found within that audit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any early guesses?
Well, we have had one audit with legislative post audit. The first round of the audit, we very much disagreed with their findings. The second round of the audit, we agreed they had high confidence in about $300 million. We agreed with that, but they had very low confidence on another $300 million, and we did not agree with their findings there. I will say we're working with various law enforcement agencies, the Office of the Inspector General of the U.S. DOL, to find these people that have taken money from the trust fund. And they're saying, the Office of the Inspector General, it's billions of dollars nationwide that have been fraudulently obtained, both domestically and internationally. It's not just us.
Any further questions for the secretary? Representative Clayton.
Well, I don't really have a question, but more of a comment, really. Sorry, I've always wanted to say that, and now I can. When you spoke for potentially advocating for raises of your fine colleagues sitting here in the gallery, I would stand in strong support of that and would just like to, again, thank you for all of your tireless work that you have put in particular when it comes to fighting the fraud. Actually, I do have one question. When we, and I keep bringing this up, but I do think that it is even more relevant now than it was the last time you were before this committee. We talk about a lot of the fraud attempts that are being made internationally. Any particular country or areas from which those are concentrated?
Thank you for your comments, Representative. And no, I don't have an update on that yet, but I can tell you we are working not only with state agencies, but federal agencies as well. We're working with the Secret Service and we're working with the FBI.
All right, thank you. No, and I appreciate this. I still want to renew my call for hearing from maybe the KBI, at least when it comes to this type of fraud, because I do think that, again, we need to continue considering this, not just from a standpoint of looking to potentially blame our department for any flaws that they might have, but also looking at this from the outlook of how do we strengthen law and order when it comes to especially international frauds that are attempting to steal money from our taxpayers by committing this fraud. Those, I believe, are the real bad actors here, and we need to continue with that attitude. So, again, expressing my gratitude to you on behalf of myself and that of my constituents. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think we can all agree to that.
Thank you.
We did attempt to give her a raise this morning in appropriations. I'm not quite sure how it's going to go at Omnibus. I had a constituent that got just as an example today, got a notice of review in the mail, and he wanted to know about it. The notice of review is just that there's been a claim filed. He has a fraud flag on his file already, and there was still a notice of review sent. That's normal, right?
Yes.
And that you'll catch that. Like
Yes.
there's already a fraud flag on his deal, so there won't be any payment.
Right, and that's just because there's been an initial claim does not mean that there's been payment. So what we do is, again, we send a notice to both the claimant and the employer. The employers where we catch a lot of those fraudulent claims.
All right, and you didn't. We did uncover that there was an uptick in fraud attempts, but it appears so far you guys are very successful in keeping the fraud at bay.
Yes, sir.
We really appreciate that. And I'm glad that waiting week's back in there to give you a little bit of time, a little breathing room. So without seeing no further questions, thanks for coming in, and thanks especially coming in when you're not feeling so well.
Thank you. I
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on committee to our next item on the agenda. It's a hearing on SB 382. And we'll get a review of the bill from Revisor Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 382 makes three principal changes to the Real Estate Brokers and Salespersons License Act. It was requested by the Kansas Real Estate Commission. First, the bill would generally prohibit individuals or persons acting as employees or owners, officers, or members of associations or trusts from dealing in assignable contracts for the purchase or sale or options on real estate without a license as a real estate broker. And I think the conferees will probably get more into what exactly assignable contracts are, but just generally, it involves entering into a real estate contract and then immediately attempting to sell or option off that contract before the closing. Second, the bill makes the provisions of the Act applicable to trusts in the same manner as the Act currently applies to associations and the business entities of corporations, limited liability companies, limited liability partnerships, and professional corporations. So it includes trusts. Third, the bill authorizes the Real Estate Commission to issue cease and desist orders for violations of the Act. Note that this bill is similar to Senate Bill 219 from last year. So turning to the bill, Section 1 amends the statute that currently defines broker in the Act with references to certain business activities regarding real estate transactions that require licensing. And the bill adds to such business activities currently listed in Section 1 of the bill the conduct of engaging in marketing for sale, exchanging, or otherwise dealing in assignable contracts for the purchase or sale of or options on real estate. Section 2, current law prohibits a person from engaging in activities of a broker without a license. The bill adds language to provide that no person acting individually or as an employee or owner, officer, or member of an association, any business entity or trust shall engage in the business of or act as a broker, associate broker, or salesperson unless licensed. So the bill expands that provision. The bill also removes language prohibiting the representation that a person engages in the business of a broker, associate broker, or salesperson. Section 3, at page 3 of the bill, amends current exceptions from the licensing requirements under the Act. There's a current exception for persons who are selling property owned by them. The bill amends that to exclude from that exception the conduct of dealing in assignable contracts for the purchase or sale or options on real estate. Similarly, the bill amends the current exception in law for licensing requirements for the sale or lease of real estate by a business entity that owns or leases such real estate. And actually, it's the exceptions for the employees of the business entity, but they have to have a 5% or greater interest in the business entity or trust. And that makes the same exception. The exemption from the Act is not going to include dealing in assignable contracts for the purchase or sale of or options on real estate. The exception in current law from licensing for the sale or lease of new homes by a business entity that constructed such homes is broadened to include new homes constructed by a trust. That's on page 4. Section 4, again, pertains to trust. It adds trust to provisions currently applicable to other business entities that prohibit such entities from being licensed and requiring that the principals or employees of such entities who conduct the activities of broker be licensed and follow requirements of establishing an office and designating a supervising broker. That's on page 5 of the bill. Section 5 provides a criminal penalty under current law for violations of the Act. The bill adds that the commission will have authority to issue cease and desist orders in accordance with the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act against unlicensed persons or associated business entities or trusts. If enacted, this bill would become effective July 1st, 2022. I note that this had a hearing on the Senate side, of course. It passed through the Senate on a vote of 38-2. That, same for questions.
Any questions for the revisor? Charles, would this preclude an individual from selling property outright themselves?
No, the bill does, under current law, there's an exception for that. The bill limits that a bit in that the exception is limited, so you can't deal in assignable contracts, which, you know, is sort of a primary subject of this bill. But otherwise, no, you can still do that.
What is an assignable contract?
Again, I think the conferees will get into the weeds on that, but based on testimony from the Senate side, it is the practice of assigning an equitable interest, also known as wholesaling, and it occurs when an individual enters into a contract to purchase real estate and immediately attempts to option that interest to another buyer prior to closing and taking ownership of the property. And there's a lot more detail that I'm sure that they'll go into on it.
Okay, thank you. And so say my mother owns, she owns a trust and she has all of her real estate in her trust. If she wanted to sell some of that, would this force her to use a realtor rather than selling it herself, or the trust selling it itself?
No, I believe the exception pertains, under current law, pertains to employees or owners that have at least a 5% interest. Yeah, that owns, okay, right. And, you know, again, the conferees can correct me if I'm wrong, but if she fits within that exemption, that is, she has a 5% or greater interest in the trust, then she can go ahead and sell real estate that the trust owns, again, with the exception that she can't, under this bill, deal in assignable contracts.
Okay, and then lastly, attorneys can sometimes sell real estate. Does this preclude them from doing that in any way, including assignable contracts?
The bill wouldn't change any prohibitions on attorneys that would be in current law, again, except that you can't deal in assignable contracts without a license, similar to the other activities that are current law listed under the definition of a broker that you can't engage in without a license.
Even an attorney, though, that...
As I understand it, you do have to have a license to engage in the activities that are set out in page 1, section 1 of the bill. There's a list of activities that sort of is part of the definition of broker, and those activities all require a license unless you have an exemption, and you know, we talked a little bit about that.
Okay, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, sir, appreciate it. We'll move on to the proponent section of the bill hearing, and we'll start with Eric Wisner, Executive Director, Kansas Real Estate Commission. Welcome to Commerce Committee, sir.
Thank you, Chairman, or Chairperson Tarwater, and members of the committee. On behalf of the Kansas Real Estate Commission, my name is Eric Wisner. I'm the Executive Director. I think Charles did a pretty good job of giving an overview of the legislation. This bill does attempt to clarify that a Kansas real estate license is required for an individual who attempts to assign an equitable interest in a real estate purchase contract for compensation to another person for real estate they don't own. So just to address some of the questions that came up previously, nothing in this bill changes the exemption from licensure for an individual who is selling property they own, whether they're doing it as an LLC, a trust, whatever. We're not touching that. What we're attempting to do is clarify that the provision in statute that requires a license to deal in options also applies to the practice of assigning an equitable interest. So just to kind of go do a more in-depth overview of what that practice is. So the practice of assigning equitable interest, which Charles mentioned is also known as wholesaling in the industry, occurs when an individual enters into a contract to purchase real estate and they immediately try to option that interest to another buyer for compensation prior to closing and taking ownership of the property. So the individual will usually market that property either through Facebook or through a listserv. They'll say they own the property when really all they have is a contract to purchase the property. They have not taken possession. Often the individual actually has no intention to purchase or take title to the property. They are just looking for an investor to transfer it to collect an assignment fee. If they cannot transfer the property to investor, oftentimes what we see is they will back out of the contract prior to closing. And then the wholesaler has structured the contract in most cases that they don't owe any earnest money to the seller, or in some cases I've seen, $10 of earnest money. It's usually very minimal, if any at all. So just kind of a real world example of what the Real Estate Commission is seeing. So we'll and this comes from, I didn't make this up out of thin air. This came from a complaint that we've received. So the wholesaler will enter into a purchase contract with the seller for let's say $50,000. Oftentimes they target properties that are in, let's just say, distressed condition, or target a seller who is needing to sell quickly. The agreement will say the transaction will close in 30 days. And obviously, as I mentioned before, usually we'll see that there's no earnest money deposit included as part of the agreement. The offer will say it's contingent on the title being clean and the seller allowing the individual to put a lockbox on the property so that if an investor wants to come see it, they can gain access to that property. In the meantime, the wholesaler, is marketing the property, like I said, on Facebook or email listservs to investors prior to closing. He finds an investor who agrees to take ownership of the property for the $50,000 price in the purchase contract, along with paying the wholesaler an assignment fee of, usually it's something like 20%, so $10,000. None of this information is disclosed to the seller. The seller has no idea that they're assigning the contract to somebody else. So prior to the 30-day closing, the wholesaler is informed there's an issue with the title. So the wholesaler then says, well, I'm not dealing with this anymore. They come over, they take the lockbox off, and they back out of the purchase contract with the seller, and they don't provide them any more details. They just walk away. So that's, like I said, this is kind of a summary of an example of a complaint that we've received regarding this activity. Some states have banned the practice of assigning equitable interests. We chose to, instead of prohibiting the practice, to clarify that someone who does these type of transactions needs to obtain a Kansas license. A Kansas real estate license is required to perform certain duties and responsibilities through Kansas law, as well as mandatory disclosures. So in the previous example, if the wholesaler had a Kansas license, they would have had to disclose any compensation received in the transaction, along with any known material defects, including deficiencies with the title. And this is according to Kansas real estate license law. We feel that clarifying this activity falls under the Kansas real estate license law, provides oversight to KREC to investigate consumer complaints. In our opinion, this is a consumer protection issue. And it provides an avenue for the public to resolve disputes and claims that otherwise would be addressed by litigation, which is obviously is costly to the public and in a lot of cases difficult to resolve. I would note that within the last 5 years, Arkansas, Illinois, Oklahoma, and Nebraska have all implemented similar legislation to what's being proposed. Actually, Nebraska, their governor signed a bill that's almost identical to this last Thursday. There are currently 3 states that I'm aware of, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Arizona, that have legislation that is pending review this year during their state legislative sessions. The commission is also requesting reasonable powers to stop this activity, to stop activities requiring a Kansas real estate license by an unlicensed individual by granting KREC the authority to issue cease and desist orders. Many other Kansas agencies, boards, and commissions have the authority to take this action. Currently, if we receive a complaint related to unlicensed activity, the only thing that we can do is send a letter to the individual conducting unlicensed activity. It says they may be in violation of license law, and if we receive another complaint, we will forward it to the local district attorney's office. We have worked with the Association of Realtors in this legislation, and they are in full support, and I will stop and see if there's any questions.
Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for coming. How big a problem is this?
I will tell you, we've seen a pretty big increase over the last 3 years in the number of complaints that we've received on this activity. I believe we get about 15 to 20 complaints a year. There's probably a lot more activity out there that we're not seeing. We're not getting direct complaints from. Where we have seen the uptick is in the past, it was mainly licensees that were complaining. What we've seen is now an increase in members of the public complaining. So they're feeling like they've been, I don't want to say tricked, but that's kind of, usually they feel like they've been swindled out of something.
Is this more of a metropolitan problem than it is in rural areas, or is it everywhere?
I would say it's definitely more of an issue in urban areas than it is in rural areas, especially, as I mentioned earlier, distressed properties in urban areas is tend to where we see it. So Wichita, Kansas City area is usually where we're getting it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just trying to get a grasp of what exactly the problem is that we're solving here. You said there's been a recent uptick within the last 3 years of the public coming to you. Care to quantify how many of these are we talking about?
Yeah, I don't have the exact number. It's, definitely a fair portion of, like I said, the 15 or 20 a year are coming from the public. Some of the complaints that we get even from the licensees are because a member of the public reached out to them and they were made aware of it, so they forwarded it on to the commission. I would say that it's just so much easier than it used to be to advertise and market property that is why we're seeing the increase in this activity. Frankly, anybody can go on Facebook and throw something up there right now.
And that's absolutely why you're getting an increase from licensees. I'm wondering about the public.
And I think that's also, that maybe they're bringing it to the public's attention that this is an activity, and we don't get involved whether or not, sometimes we get complaints, well, they're not getting the fair market value for their property. And while that might be the case, that's not really where the real estate commission gets involved. Our concern is when, there's potential for, like I mentioned in my example, if there's a defect in the title and it's not being disclosed to the seller, the person's just leaving. That's where we have concerns that this is a consumer protection issue. And obviously, too, not disclosing the compensation in the real estate transaction. The seller has no idea that they're basically selling it to another investor.
Right, but they're still receiving the amount that they agreed to receive.
Except when like I said, the issue happens with the title and they back out, and they, if that was in a real estate transaction, the licensee would have to disclose that. In this case, because they're not licensed or they're claiming they don't need a license, then that's why in our opinion, that's a consumer protection issue, or the commission's opinion, that's a consumer protection issue.
Okay, so we're looking at, as far as the public is concerned, the impact is for people who weren't told that their title wasn't clear. Is that really what we're looking at? Is that the purpose for this entire bill?
That's one example of the consumer protection aspect. Another one is I mentioned that the investor could put a lockbox on the property. Well, there's minimum duties of care that if a real estate licensee does that they're, if somebody's accessing the property, that they've, make sure that nothing is removed or things like that. Whereas, there's no protection for the consumer in this, because even if, there's nothing that the real estate commission can do, or the licensee is not subject to losing their license or anything like that. So that's kind of where we step in. And I should mention too, that there are current, companies right now who have a real estate license, who they deal in this type of transactions. They work with, whether they own it or they're helping somebody, assign the contract, but, they're licensed. And if we get a complaint against them, we can actually, frankly, conduct an investigation. And if we find they've, not disclose something to their client or there's property that's been mishandled, that we can actually take action against their license.
Was it one of those companies that brought you the criterion for the bill?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm just aware
just
that,
checking.
no, I've just seen purchase contracts. You know, we do audits of brokerages, and I've just seen purchase contracts where it's like, oh, well, they're licensed and they do this type of transaction. So I know there's licensed companies that have a real estate license that do this type of work.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Miller, Esquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several questions. Cut me off when you feel the need to.
Okay, moving on.
Yes, I asked for that. I'm not sure why you use the term wholesaler to describe these people. How are they wholesaling?
That's Representative. That's actually a good question. That's just the term of art used in the industry.
Yeah, I know it's a term of art. It doesn't sound to me like it applies.
Well, and that's why in the law we're really what we're talking about. And yeah, the wholesaling thing for our purposes, we're talking about people who are assigning their equitable interest in the purchase contract.
Okay. Would you agree with me that in the normal concept of wholesaler, it's not a good description?
And yes, and then actually there could be instances where wholesaling is completely allowed by law.
And you, at one point you described, or you used the term tricked. How are these people, quote unquote, tricked?
It appears that the people who are doing this, that are assigning the equitable interest in the purchase contract, are holding themselves out to be licensees. They think that they're working with somebody that's licensed. A lot of times the sellers in these deals are not very sophisticated.
Okay, that was actually my next question. Were they posing as a licensed realtor? And that to me sounds like a very distinct offense that doesn't need to be newly defined.
We don't usually see that they're proposing that they work for a real estate company. They might say that they're, the business that when they enter into the contract, it's, something like John Smith Real Estate Holdings or John Smith Real Estate or something like that, or they could just use their name. But when we've gotten complaints from the consumer, that's one of the time. In some instances, they thought they were actually dealing with a real estate licensee.
Again, that's something that's currently prohibited by law. You can't pose as a licensed realtor when you're not.
You can't, but the Real Estate Commission can't really do anything against an individual that's unlicensed right now anyways. I mean, they're in the same boat as people that are assigning the equitable interests, is that if we find somebody who may be holding themselves out to have a real estate license, as of now, we really can't do anything about it.
And you said that one of the options was an outright ban of the activity. Why did you not select that option?
Because we've seen models, like I mentioned, where real estate licensees do this activity and are licensed. So, in our opinion, it's not. I know there is some consumer protection issue about maybe it would be better just to ban it, but we've seen that it can work. It's just we feel that it should be an activity that requires a Kansas license.
And my last point, Mr. Chairman, somewhat of what you described, it sounded to me like people are just making bad deals when they sell their property and only ask for a $10 earnest money. They're sort of asking for a bad deal to happen. Thank you.
Representative Kessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a constituent reach out to me just a few months ago, and she was in a situation, this might add some clarity to help some of this out as well, but she was in a situation that she needed to move and she needed to sell her house. And she responded to one of these ads that say we buy houses or whatever it is. And she responded to one of these companies. They had a real fancy name like Happy Home Buyers or something. I don't know. But anyway, but she responded to this ad, and she had already come to the conclusion that she's not really expecting to make anybody off the house. She's just wanting to cover the mortgage and move on down the road and start her life somewhere else. So this company came in and said, yes, we'll buy your house. You owe X on the house. We're going to pay you X on the house. And here's what we're going to do. Well, come to find out, she wasn't necessarily paying attention at the closing. There was missing some dates on the closing paper, but she didn't think much about it. But at the end of the day, she wasn't expecting any proceeds. So there wasn't any red flags that came up, nothing that stood out of the ordinary. It just seemed like a normal real estate transaction, except when she, a few months down the road, went to go buy another house. The bank's like, well, wait a minute, you still have a house. You still have a mortgage on this house. So as she's investigating this other company actually is making her mortgage payments at her bank. All that was disclosed during the closing. And that company is actually making her mortgage payments, but it's still in her name. She's not able to buy another house at this point. And upon trying to figure out what her options are, she has been told by multiple agencies now she has 0 options at this point, that there's literally nothing she can do. And this other company is actually renting her house out like a rent to buy situation, but they're years away from actually selling the house to the rent to own people. So I appreciate you bringing something like this up.
Sounds like we found a carrier for the bill. Should have passed. Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like others here, I'm trying to put my finger on the problem. So you've got a buyer that's signing a contract with the seller. And before he closes, this buyer is assigning this contract to another person, right? Before he closes on it. What would keep you from just putting a line in the contract that says this contract's not assignable?
That's a fair question, Representative. I suppose the seller could require that be included in the contract. I just don't know that there's the sophistication on the side of the seller, especially the properties that we've received complaints on, to know to include that.
When we sign mortgages at banks, for instance, it'll say there on the mortgage, this mortgage is not assignable. It was meant for you and you alone, period. And if I have a loan on my house, I go to sell my house, and I tell the buyer, hey, just take my mortgage over. That won't work. The mortgage is not assignable. The contract could be the same way, which negates the need for this bill almost, at least that portion of the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So are these companies, Representative Kessler said, are these companies the ones like you see the billboards that say we buy ugly houses and those sort of things? Or are those reputable companies? Is that what you're trying to get at?
So that's a good question, Representative. In some cases, there is a crossover between the individuals who are assigning equitable contracts and the companies that, we buy ugly houses or we buy any house. Sometimes there is an overlap. Sometimes those companies that they don't deal in assignable contracts. They actually purchase the home, put some work into it, flip it, sell it, which is allowed by law, and nothing in this bill changes that. I'm not going to say necessarily they're reputable. I can't speak to that. But there are some who, I have seen complaints come in where they basically, that's, their slogan is, we'll buy anything, any type of real estate. I would maybe also like to address the issue about assignable contracts and the language. I think the caution I would have about putting that in a contract that it can't be assignable is that there are instances where I think, that would be appropriate. We are talking only about requiring a license for people who deal in this for compensation. You know, we've had questions come up. Well, what about, you know, I want to buy, you know, a person wants to buy a property, and, you know, prior to closing, they, you know, have a health emergency or something, and they're like, well, I can't do it now, but can I sign it to my brother to purchase or something like that? I'm not going to charge a fee. I'm just going to give it over to him. That would be allowed because it's not for compensation. So, and like I mentioned, there are companies who currently have real estate license that deal in this, that I can't speak to whether or not they're reputable or not, but we have no proof that they're, you know, not disclosing their compensation in the contract, or they're actually required to disclose the compensation. So they're doing everything required in Kansas law. So I think that would be the concern about requiring that in a contract, or prohibit assigning the equitable interest in the contract.
Representative Dodson.
Just, thanks, Mr. Chairman. A couple of quick questions. One, are the things that you're seeing illegal or merely deceitful?
Well, under current Kansas law, if you are dealing in options and real estate for property that you don't own, that's an activity requiring a license. So if you do not have a license, then that is an unlawful act. It's with this practice, and as it's become more prevalent, I think there is a question, and we use, you know, the Attorney General's office for legal counsel, like many other small boards and commissions do, that we needed to clarify our law to address that. When you're dealing in, you know, assignable contracts, you are dealing in options and you don't own the property because you haven't taken title, you haven't closed on the property. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we feel that this would make it clear that those activities do require a license, and if you do not obtain a license, then yes, it is unlawful.
We're still seeing advertisements from the Attorney General talking about roofing contractors. So the question is, how do you tell? You know, when you look at somebody's advertising in a realty company, you might see broker owner, licensed real estate agent, and any string of 3 letters after their name. So how do you tell if someone's licensed?
Well, I mean, we always tell people if you want to look to determine, I mean, we can't control, you know, what occurs in advertising. So, you know, somebody could say, I'm John Smith Real Estate and I'm selling something. That if they're not licensed, then they would be in violation of, you know, our law potentially by advertising that if they don't own the property that they're transacting, they would be in violation of our law. As far as like if somebody from the public wants to know if they're licensed, we do have on our website, you can go in there and put anybody's name or a company name and in search, and it will tell you if they have a license in Kansas or not.
Because I think for most people, if they walk into a building with a sign over the door, there's an assumption that the person is a licensed realtor. So thanks for your responses. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I have a couple of quick things. This bill referenced brokers. Do you have to be a broker to deal with a assignable contract after this law passes?
That's a great question. So no, the definition of broker, it's a little bit weird how the law works, but basically in Kansas, you can either be a broker or there's a lower level license that's called a salesperson. The definition of a broker also applies to the salesperson. If you look in the definition section, it says this also is basically required for salespersons. The difference really between a broker and a salesperson is the salesperson's an entry level license, so there's not as much education. The examination requirements are less stringent. And the other thing is, if you want to operate a brokerage in the state of Kansas, you have to be a broker. You can't operate it as a salesperson. So every salesperson works under the supervision of a broker in Kansas.
So a salesperson can't be his own salesperson.
Yeah, you can't have a company and just a salesperson.
Yeah, I think we did that a couple of years ago. little barrier to entry for realtors.
The legislature did increase the requirements to obtain a broker's license in Kansas.
Yeah, I was just jabbing you a little bit. So, so a sales agent could deal in assignable contracts. Does this preclude a lawyer from dealing in assignable contracts? Because a lot of lawyers are also, they are realtors because they've studied real estate law.
So yeah, this is a good question. It does come up on occasion. There is actually an exemption in Kansas law, license law, related to services rendered by an attorney. Basically, if you're licensed to practice in Kansas and you're performing activities under the attorney's professional duties as an attorney, that is not something that requires a real estate license. However, if you're doing something outside of that, even if you're an attorney, you do need to obtain a Kansas license. I will tell you, the requirements basically for an attorney getting a license are the same as anybody else. However, like if an attorney wants to be a broker or something like that, the commission usually considers their legal experience to be equivalent. And that's not in all cases, but a lot of times the attorneys are allowed to have a broker's license, even if they don't have the transactions, because they have the law background.
All right, we're coming close to running out of time. I have one more question on these letters, the cease and desist letters that you're wanting to do. Can you tell me how that works, or what would be the penalty per se? Or where's the teeth in the letter? You can send a cease and desist letter. Anybody can send one, but what would be the teeth?
Basically, it doesn't have as much teeth as potentially a civil penalty or a fine. Essentially, what the cease and desist order would do is basically come from the commission and says you need to stop practicing any activities that require a Kansas license. If they chose to continue to conduct activities requiring a license, then they would be violating an order of the commission, so we'd have standing to go prosecute them in district court. What we're hoping is when they get the cease and desist letter, that motivates them to either stop doing what they're doing or obtain a license. The commission considered the civil penalty authority for unlicensed individuals. The reality is people that are not licensed, if you assess them a fine, you very rarely collect it.
Okay, so who is your first target? Who's the first letter going to? The name just popped into your head. Spit it out. Let's go.
Whoever complains to the real estate commission after investigation, we find that they're conducting unlicensed activity.
All right. Seeing no further questions, we'll go on into Mark Toom. And Mark, you're lucky you only have a few minutes. So
I'll be very quick because I think a lot of the comments and questions Eric already answered. But Chairman Charwitter, members of the House Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify today on this bill. My name is Mark Toom. I'm the Vice President of Governmental Affairs with the Kansas Association of Realtors. And just since it was mentioned a couple times in the questions and the exchange, there is a difference between real estate licensee and realtor. I know that they're realtor. They're often used interchangeable. All realtors are licensees, but not all licensees are realtors. Realtors choose to subscribe to the code of ethics in addition to being a licensee. But that's not why I'm here. I just wanted to kind of clear up that confusion. But first and foremost, CAR is here because this change would benefit consumers. And we believe that also granting reasonable investigative powers to KREC is also something that will protect consumers. This would effectively eliminate or certainly require that somebody engaged in this practice would be having a real estate license, and it's been labeled a predatory practice. In fact, similar legislation that was mentioned, the legislation in Oklahoma was called the Predatory Real Estate Wholesaler Prohibition Act. And I think that passed 91-1 and 46-0. The legislation that was mentioned in Nebraska, there was only 2 votes against it. I know they have a weird unicameral, but there was just 2 votes against it. But we view this as really a consumer protection legislation. Home is generally somebody's largest purchase, and this bill will protect consumers from potentially fraudulent activities. And we'd ask that you act favorably on this legislation. Be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Any questions for Mr. Toom? Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure, Mr. Tim, that if a realtor is the buyer and before he closes, he assigns a contract, then everything's okay, right?
Say that, well, if we can say it's real estate,
The realtor
or
guy signs a
licensee.
contract to buy a house and he happens to be a realtor.
Do they own an interest in the house, or are they just assigning
No,
the
they're
contract?
buying it.
They're buying it.
They're buying it. And before they close, that guy that's buying it assigns that contract to someone else. That's okay because he's a realtor.
I don't think that's the case. I'm trying to follow your example. And I don't know if, because it's not specific to being a realtor or not, but I don't know if that's, do you understand that? Yeah.
Can a realtor deal in a assignable contract?
Yes, under this, yes, and under this law.
But he's the only buyer that can because he's got a license.
No, any buyer, they could be involved in that transaction. The transaction would have to be facilitated by somebody with a real estate license.
Okay.
Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, that brings up a question then. A licensed realtor then engages in this activity. Are they required by their code or whatever your requirements are they required to notify the seller that they are handling an assignable contract at that point?
Well, when you're a realtor, and it kind of depends on what side of the transaction, you have obligations to treat certain buyers and sellers and then disclose certain information. So you would be required to provide that compensation and where you are in that transaction.
So you'd have to tell the seller that you may be doing an assignable contract.
You have to disclose.
Have to disclose. And that's by law or by real estate?
I think it's current.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no further questions.
Right, thank you.
There's one more. Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry to drag this out, guys, but this last question prompted a question for me. All right. So a real estate agent, a realtor, can take part in these assignable contracts, no problem. They could dish it off to someone else, turn a profit. The difference is that they have to disclose.
They have to disclose, but I would also argue if you're, if you're representing the seller of the property, you're also probably providing a service of what that property is worth. Certainly, if you're a realtor with code of ethics obligations, you have an obligation to provide, fair advice, fair dealings, and provide, information on that property's worth. When you're involved in one of these assignable contracts, you're dealing with unsophisticated buyers very often in depressed areas. So you're under no obligation to tell them what that property is worth. So then in that case, you may be, you're pocketing the difference that you can assign that equitable interest. I'm not sure if I'm.
Well, the realtor in what's going on in my head is representing the buyer, or in this case, is the buyer. In which case, what obligation do they have to the homeowner or the soon-to-be previous homeowner?
I think you'd be under this law. You'd be obligated to provide what your compensation is.
Okay, but you said that's not in this law.
I think it would be required because you'd be required to be a real estate licensee. I believe that's the case.
And you said that's
already existing
under
law.
current law.
Right.
All right, so someone serving in that role, not a realtor,
separate from the state law. The realtor is you're a member of my professional association,
exactly.
and you just so happen to have a real estate, and you've signed on to the code of ethics, and are taking a certain amount of continuing education through my associations.
Right. I'm following that part. The part that I'm not following is that there seems to be some schism in the fact that whether or not Kansas law applies to a licensee or a non-licensee. What I'm saying is, if a licensee were handling this transaction, he were the buyer, or she, Pam could be the buyer, but whoever's the buyer doesn't have or does have an obligation to disclose the status of any other contracts that they may be under. But a non-licensee does not have that obligation under Kansas law currently?
And under current law, they don't have that obligation. That's what this bill, I think, is trying to change.
I'm sorry?
And the current law would preclude a non-licensee from doing anything at all. It wouldn't require them to disclose. It would just require them to not do the deal.
This type of transaction would now have to be facilitated by somebody with a license, a real estate license.
All right, I think that helps me out for now.
Okay.
I may come back to you, however. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Not today.
Right.
Representative Miller has a question, and this will eat into the hour of life that I owe you for the other day.
You said something earlier that confused me, because you said something about the representing the seller and buying the property. If you're representing a seller, you're not allowed to buy the property. That's part of your code of ethics, I would think.
You have to disclose if you have any sort of ownership interest in any property that you have.
No, but can you buy property? You as an individual representing the seller, buy the seller's property?
As a realtor, or
yeah, as a realtor. You said you described it as representing the seller. So if you're representing the seller, that's as a realtor. You can't buy property that you're listing for a seller yourself.
I guess I think I was talking about providing the services of the sale, but I don't know if I will have to.
I think it was just a misspeak.
I'll follow up with you and just make sure that I get your question answered.
Thank you, Mr.
All right, seeing no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Tim. Okay, we don't have any other proponents or opponents and no written. So we're going to close the hearing and we're going to adjourn. We'll see you all tomorrow for the ban on the bag bill.